Well, when you look at the kind of input Musk has been having into politics, there has been some polling done which suggests there is a strong dissatisfaction with.
America found itself at the epicenter of a trade war whose consequences will be felt for years to come. At a time when the whole world was waiting for a response to President Trump's actions, no one could have imagined that this would lead to such massive losses for the US itself. Mercedes, BMW, and Audi, three titans of the global automotive industry, suddenly and without warning left the US market. It would seem that this is just one step in a trade war, but the consequences of this decision shook the country's economy to its core. Tens of thousands of jobs are disappearing, billions of dollars in investments are going up in smoke, and car manufacturers, once the pride of American roads, and will no longer be speeding down us highways.
They're doing what they should be doing, perhaps, for the European Union, but it does create ill will. And as you know, we're going to be doing reciprocal tariffs. So whatever they charge us, we're charging them.
What led to such a dramatic step? Why did German auto giants decide to put an end to their business in the world's largest economy? The answer lies in Trump's introduction of incredibly harsh 200% tariffs on all imported cars and auto parts. This was a real blow to German manufacturers, who have always been considered a symbol of luxury and technological progress on American roads. But was such measures justified?
In other words, pre-substitution, if we just continue as we are now. But of course, people will start to substitute. They will find other goods. And as the Christmas Tree Association said a moment or two ago, it's going to be very difficult to find substitution of many things that we currently get from China.
German automakers could not fail to respond to such economic sanctions. They took an incredibly risky step that turned out to be mathematically sound. They abandoned production in the US, leaving the country without its familiar brands. Their decisions came as a shock to American dealers, who found themselves in a dead end without supplies, without spare parts, and without support from the biggest auto giants. And all this happened in just a couple of months.
The higher the tariff, the more likely it is to have them come into the country.
The higher the tariff, the more you're going to put on the value of that piece, those goods, the higher people are going to have to pay in shops.
But Trump wasn't the only one who suffered losses from this crisis. The US economy went through a real storm, and small family businesses linked to the auto industry were hit hard. Their bankruptcies affected thousands of people whose lives were tied to this industry. And what happened to car enthusiasts? Many fans of German brands who had admired these cars for years couldn't believe that one day their favorite brands would disappear from us roads. A culture of repair and tuning began to flourish, and garages across the country became places where fans created unique cars with their own hands. America was experiencing its own automotive revolution.
There are surveys like the Michigan survey, consumer sentiment, and it's a really worrying number because at some point these sentiment surveys feed into hard data of real consumer spending. And we know this from history and precedent, that's what happens. So when we see a number as bad as this one, it is only a matter of time, unless anything else changes that would suddenly make people more cheerful. Look at that chart. I mean, just look at it. Unless people suddenly become more cheerful, why would this not translate into spending? You see, that consumer lab, the lab from Yale, that number of 4,700, that is providing you don't start substituting goods.
But this was only the beginning. Germany responded to Trump's actions. The European Union pulled out all the stops to protect its interests. Instead of giving in to threats, German automakers began to actively work with China, building new factories and opening research centers in Asia. Trump seemed to have won, but in the end, he became a victim of his own policies. One question remains: what next? How will the US economy survive this blow? And how will this global car war end?
Yeah, you'll be surprised just how much we get exclusively from China. And Jim, I'm really curious to get your perspective on the White House's handling of this situation. Not so much the tariffs that have been announced, but this reporting that the White House, that officials have made clear to Beijing that they want Xi to ask for a call with Trump.
In early 2025, the world witnessed the decision of automotive giants once the pride of the US, to leave the American market. Mercedes, BMW, and Audi, three brands that for decades had epitomized luxury, innovation, and cutting-edge technology, suddenly disappeared from American roads. This news shocked not only car enthusiasts, but also threatened tens of thousands of jobs and destroyed the entire ecosystem that had existed around the US automotive industry for centuries. What caused this turn of events?
The Chinese impression is that they are willing to at least negotiate, not necessarily on Donald Trump's terms, but to talk. But their impression is that the U.S. has not opened channels and not made an effort to open up channels.
First, it is worth noting that the departure of German automakers was not just a corporate decision. It was the result of a long, simmering conflict in global trade. In 2024, a few months after President Trump imposed 200% tariffs on imported cars and auto parts, it became clear that the consequences for foreign production would be catastrophic. This move was aimed at bringing production back to the US and weakening competition from foreign companies. However, the president's policy hurt not only German manufacturers, but also the entire market they had built up over the years.
Right now, 145 going up against 125. These are the tariffs between the world's two biggest economies.
And here's another number, 4,700, or about $400 per month. That is how much more money Yale's now estimating, the Yale Budget Lab, that President Trump's tariffs are going to cost average households each year. And with just hours left in trading, the Dow right now.
The American auto industry, with its workforce, research centers, and factories, was key to the country's economy. However, Trump, wanting to bring jobs back to America, made a decision that many considered too radical. Realizing that in order to ensure the competitiveness of American manufacturers, it was necessary to reduce dependence on foreign supplies, he decided to create new economic barriers. This move was certainly not accidental. Trump was confident that tough measures would help revive American manufacturing and create favorable conditions for local manufacturers such as Ford and General Motors. But something went wrong.
We shouldn't be surprised with all that's coming out and all the worries about tariffs. It's not just that, it's the complexity of everything else as well. The changes within the federal government, the worries about job losses, the worries about a slowing economy, higher inflation, and eventually you get these
German automakers, for their part, were not prepared for such a sharp turn of events. All three companies, which had been operating steadily in the US market for many years, did not expect such a blow. Excessively high tariffs made production in the US economically unviable for them. Moreover, such measures threatened not only the businesses of these companies, but also the investments they had made in the development of production facilities and infrastructure. Having decided to withdraw completely from the US market, Mercedes, BMW, and Audi began planning their next steps. This departure was not a flash in the pan. It was a strategic decision dictated by harsh economic conditions that German companies could not cope with.
But it's also an opening to say, okay, we're capping this for now, and that perhaps offers a way forward that we could begin talking about how to bring these down.
For automakers, the decision to leave the US market was not an easy one. It meant not only the loss of a sales market, but also the destruction of many local jobs. Numerous dealerships across the country were threatened with closure, and with them, small businesses that serviced these cars. Ultimately, this was a real economic shock for the US. However, for German car giants, the decision to leave the US was inevitable. Tariffs made it impossible to maintain profitability, and they had no choice but to look for new avenues for development. So they began to focus on other markets, particularly China, where political stability and a premium market offered new opportunities for growth. This move left Americans perplexed. Against the backdrop of this change, it seemed that the world order that had existed in the automotive industry for many years was beginning to crumble. But could anything else have been expected? Of course, Trump set himself the goal of bringing manufacturing back to the US, but he failed to take into account an important aspect: that globalization and the economy are interdependent. When you build trade barriers and introduce such harsh measures, the consequences will be felt not only by foreign companies, but also by the economy itself. The market that had provided jobs and support for the automotive industry for decades fell victim to ambitious political decisions.
Lived in China. You've covered China for some time now. As we're looking at this question of who's going to blink first, with two very different political systems, what is your gauge on this?
Well, different systems, listen, one's a democracy, one is not. One's a single-party state, very much not a democracy. But China does have politics, and Chinese leaders do not want to be seen, we were talking about this yesterday, I believe, do not want to be seen as capitulating to America. That is not good politics for a Chinese leader.
In addition to political and economic reasons, there was another side to this process, a cultural one. For Americans, cars from German manufacturers had become more than just a means of transportation. They were a symbol of status, innovation, and luxury. With the departure of these brands from the market, a whole part of automotive culture disappeared, leaving a void in its place. Instead of enjoying quality and technological advances, American car enthusiasts were faced with the reality that not everything that comes with globalization stays for long. Many dealers, faced with the closure of their businesses, began to look for new ways to survive. Car markets experienced sharp fluctuations. Many began to lose ground, while others, such as Tesla, suddenly began to feel more confident amid weakening competition. Nevertheless, the consequences for the industry were inevitable. The loss of millions of jobs and billions in investment forced people to think about the consequences of such a radical step.
To allow that. So now you have the U.S. president say, well, I'm not going to open those channels. China has to open them first. It's kind of ridiculous at the end of the day, because you are playing with the interests of American consumers, Chinese consumers, etc. The other point I would make about China's reaction today in not quite meeting the U.S. tariffs, 145%, U.S. China goes to 125, and in Xi's statement he says, we're going to 125 in response. That's as high as we're going because this is getting a little ridiculous, right? And that's both a signal to say we're not going to get caught up in this tit for tat to the degree that the president is.
The situation forces us to ask the question, was this a winning move for the U.S., or was the result a disaster that will be felt in the economy for years to come? After Trump decided to impose 200% tariffs on cars and auto parts, many began to realize that this could be a real blow to the economy. The tariffs were intended to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. and reduce dependence on foreign manufacturers. However, the consequences for German car manufacturers have been much more devastating than expected. German companies such as Mercedes, BMW, and Audi had been successfully manufacturing cars in American factories for many years, as investing billions in job creation and a developed dealer network. But Trump's move disrupted all their plans. When Trump imposed such high tariffs, it threatened their entire business model in the U.S. Companies had to urgently review their strategies and make decisions that were no longer as profitable. German automakers decided to withdraw completely from the U.S. market, despite huge financial investments and many years of operation in this market. This was not a move driven by anger or impulsiveness, but by harsh economic necessity. Analysts said that with tariffs rising, companies could not continue to operate without losses, and the only logical decision was to leave the market.
Up. You're seeing that swing here going into the afternoon, up almost 650 points. But it was up and down there throughout earlier in the day. With us now, we have CNN business editor-at-large Richard Quest. We have CNN chief national security analyst Jim Sciutto as well. Richard, a key economic gauge, the consumer sentiment now at its second lowest level on record, going back to 1952. Why?
Mercedes-Benz, for example, left behind huge factories in Alabama that produced cars for the entire North American region. In 2025, the factory was closed, leaving only an empty lot covered with rain and snow. Dealers who worked with Mercedes were in despair. They were given no time to adapt to the new conditions. This meant not only a loss of income for salespeople, but also the destruction of jobs that employed thousands of Americans.
Well, if they did fall on deaf ears, but it's just the latest example in the really day by day, the deepening trade war that is underway between the United States and China. Yes, we are learning that U.S. officials privately behind the scenes urged China to not retaliate. In fact, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been saying that publicly all along. warning countries to not retaliate. Well, those warnings have fallen on deaf ears, particularly with China, as they raised their tariffs to 125%. The question now is which side is going to blink?
BMW and Audi followed suit. They left the American market despite many years of successful presence there. BMW closed its plant in South Carolina, where cars for the entire North American region were manufactured, and froze its expansion plans in the US. Audi decided to leave the premium segment, which also affected large dealer networks. For all three companies, this was not just an economic blow, but also a cultural one. A car that had been a symbol of German engineering for decades became unavailable to American buyers.
Including Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon. President Trump with the Irish Prime Minister visiting the White House today. The president suggesting his tariffs won't stop here, saying, of course, I'm going to respond. And tonight, right here, the new poll showing 56% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the economy. The number's even worse now on the president's tariffs. ABC's chief White House correspondent Mary Bruce leading us off.
Today, President Trump side by side in the Oval Office with the head of the Irish government.
Small businesses traditionally associated with the automotive industry quickly felt the impact of the German company's decision. This was particularly noticeable in cities and states where car manufacturing was the backbone of the economy. Take Alabama, for example, a state with major Mercedes-Benz manufacturing facilities. With the departure of German automakers, dozens of small businesses involved in auto parts servicing and supply were on the brink of collapse. These businesses were unable to quickly adapt to a new reality in which their main customers, the big auto giants, had left the market. German companies invested huge sums in the US economy, creating not only jobs but also infrastructure that supported tens of thousands of people. For example, the Mercedes plant in Alabama alone employed about 4,000 people, including not only the company's own employees, but also numerous contractors who supplied the plant with all the necessary materials and services. The closure of such a plant meant not only the loss of jobs, but also the collapse of entire production chains that had been built up over many years. In addition, these companies always supported local communities by sponsoring cultural and educational programs and financing small businesses. When their production was shut down, this contribution to the local economy disappeared. But that was only the beginning. With the departure of German brands from the US market, dealers found themselves in a critical situation. Entrepreneurs who owned car dealerships and service centers working with German brands were left without merchandise. Many car dealerships, being associated with these brands, had no other cars to sell, as the market was heavily focused on premium segment vehicles. Some of these dealers, despite their many years of effort, were forced to close, losing not only their income, but also their dignity. They did not receive proper notification from manufacturers, which caused real panic. The closure of these businesses triggered a chain reaction that affected thousands of workers, from mechanics to administrative staff. But even more important was how this situation affected the education and training of specialists in the automotive industry. Universities and colleges that had been training specialists to work for large automotive companies for decades began to face a sharp decline in student numbers. Programs that had been designed to train engineers, technologists, and service specialists were now becoming obsolete. Previously popular courses in automotive technology and industrial management began to close as demand for specialists in these fields plummeted. Instead of supporting the development of their specialists, educational institutions began to adapt to the new reality by focusing on the aerospace industry and renewable energy sources. This has left an entire generation of young professionals in a difficult position. Students who were just starting their careers and making plans for the future in the automotive industry now find themselves out of work. Even those who studied engineering, which once guaranteed stable jobs and high salaries, now face employment challenges. Internship and joint training programs that provided jobs at large automotive companies have also been shut down. American high school and college students who chose the automotive industry as a promising career path have now been forced to rethink their plans. This crisis has led to noticeable changes in the lives of students and young professionals. Many of them found themselves looking for new paths. Some began to rethink their professions, trying to adapt to the new conditions of the labor market. Others, unwilling to give up their dream of working in the automotive industry, tried to continue their studies abroad. Meanwhile, even those students who completed their courses were unable to find suitable jobs, as the shortage of vacancies in the industry intensified competition and led to a drop in wages in the automotive industry. Other areas that depended on the automotive industry were also affected by this crisis. Construction companies involved in the construction of car factories, as well as companies that supplied construction materials and equipment to car manufacturers, also suffered. The labor market related to the automotive industry was on the verge of collapse. Over time, this blow to the economy became particularly noticeable in cities and states where the automotive industry was the foundation of prosperity. Falling incomes, closing businesses, and mass unemployment all made the picture even bleaker. Thus, the consequences of the departure of German automakers were far from limited to the automotive industry. It was a systemic crisis that affected dozens of related industries and hundreds of thousands of people across the country. Even with the short-term gains for American automakers, the long-term consequences proved to be much more devastating for the entire US economy.